Hey, I'm Brooke Halliday, licensed professional clinical counselor and your host of Coloring Outside the Lines. I believe that we are the byproducts of our experiences and the environments in which we were raised, and most of us have earned a few scars from those things over the years. I've been making it my mission to help people learn to accept themselves and have compassion for everything that they've survived. Through deep and vulnerable conversations with some amazing women, you're going to hear about major moments in their life when they chose to color outside the lines and demonstrate firsthand just how capable we all are. So get ready to be inspired as we color outside the lines and make something beautiful. Today I'm chatting with Lindsay, who is a licensed professional clinical counselor in the state of Minnesota who specializes in working with adolescents and adults. She has a passion for working with the perinatal population. Lindsay's been married to her husband, Will, for 8 years and has 2 girls, ages 3 and 1. Join me as I hold space for Lindsay's experience with infertility, miscarriage, and postpartum trauma. Lindsay's episode will actually come out in 2 different parts because we got so into her story and lost track of time a little bit. Without further ado, here is Lindsay. Why don't you just start by kind of giving us the background for how you and your husband met, kids, all of that kind of stuff, and we'll just start there.
I love that you're having this conversation. I really think the only way that we can really move forward is to bring voice and attention to the stories that we don't talk about, or there doesn't feel like there's space to share. I met my husband at a New Year's party going into 2012. We've been married now for 8 years. Got married in 2015. And we always knew we wanted kids. So that was something we talked about really early on. What are your plans for the future? What do you value? What are your goals? And so that was just always part of our plan. And we started trying in December of 2016. I went off birth control for the first time since I was young. I mean, I started birth control, like a lot of teenagers, irregular periods, right? Which later I would learn there's a reason for that.
How old were you when you started birth control, and like what were your primary concerns for getting on it? Because I know there's a big conversation about birth control now and not knowing the long-term side effects of it.
Right, 100%. I couldn't even tell you the exact age. I want to say probably around 16. And it was really just irregular periods. Like they were really unpredictable. I didn't know when it was going to happen. I had some issues with cramping. So you go to the doctor and they're like, well, here's this pill and this will regulate things, right?
Magic solution, right?
Yeah, right. 100%. So was on that for probably a decade. I don't even think I changed birth control at all. I think I was just like on the same one. So I go off, and we knew pretty quickly that something was wrong. So typically a doctor won't see you until you've been trying for a year.
Isn't that insane? So how quickly did you realize? I think when I work with women, they start to realize something is up about 3 months in, and then to have to wait 4 times as long to see a doctor.
Yep. Yeah, I was, it feels weird to say fortunate. I was fortunate in this scenario because I didn't go back to getting regular periods. Like I went off birth control, and I think in the first 5 or 6 months, I maybe only had 1 period. And so my doctor was like, we're going to start some tests. Like you should have your period by now. And I went to this OBGYN, and gosh, that was an experience in itself. Ultimately was diagnosed with PCOS, and he told me that if I just lost 10 to 15% of my body weight, then I would probably be able to get pregnant. Yeah. And I was like, okay. But I eat well, I exercise, like I don't know what else I can do. Like I feel
Mhm.
like I'm doing everything in my control to be healthy. And so for that and a couple other reasons, I went to a different doctor. Um, and so the process from there was to try and get the PCOS under control. Because when you, for me, not for every woman, but for a lot of women that have PCOS, they're not ovulating regularly. And
Okay.
we know that if you're not ovulating, you can't get pregnant.
Mhm.
So from there, it was really trying to figure out how to get ovulation to happen regularly so that we could get pregnant.
Can I pause you just a little bit and have you
Yeah.
rewind and just talk a little bit about what you know about PCOS, what you've learned from your experience and like the symptoms
Yeah.
that you've noticed? Because
Yeah,
I think
for
more and
sure.
more women are getting that diagnosis and they're like being told like you won't have kids, like and lose
Oh,
weight. Like
totally.
those are the two
Yeah.
things
Oh, yeah.
people come in and say. And so like what do you know about it? What is your education and understanding about PCOS?
Yeah. So I knew pretty much nothing about PCOS when I was first diagnosed. Other than, I mean, I had known some other girls from like friends from the past who had PCOS, and I always associated it with obesity. Like this is something that
Mhm.
happens maybe because of obesity. I didn't know, right? And we know that's not the reality. So I don't want to make it seem like that's the case, but that was my perception at the time.
And that's the
Um,
perception a lot of doctors put out there too, is that like
yeah,
PCOS only impacts people who are obese, and we know that that's just factually not accurate.
right. And even that was when I told people, like I told some people in my family, it was a really hard diagnosis for me. And people were like, "What? Like, how is that possible? You're not overweight." And I was like, "Well, that's not what it's about. Like, that's a symptom. So
Mhm.
obesity is can be a symptom for some people. Um, for me, my symptoms were um, obviously not getting my period regularly, so not ovulating.
Mhm.
I had cysts on my ovaries. Um, I did have I wasn't overweight, but I always felt like my body was different, and I don't know how to explain that other than just saying I had this feeling.
Mhm.
Um, Trying to think what else. I would have some pretty bad cramping when I was off birth control. Birth control helped a lot. But those were kind of my primary symptoms. Also, there's some connection with mood issues, and
Yes.
I've always when I was younger, I had some pretty severe depression, anxiety issues in high school, which got significantly better in early adulthood thanks to a lot of therapy and a lot of work.
Yes. Yes.
But I do think that there was a connection there too.
I think that's so overlooked too that people will go to the doctor and they will say like something about my body does not feel right, and doctors are so quick to say like, oh, it's psychosomatic, like work with a
Mhm.
therapist. And not that that's bad advice, it's just so minimizing and it overlooks the natural instincts, like you said, of like, I just knew that something felt wrong or something felt off in my body. And so, like, I hear that too. And like, it's so frustrating. And I just hope the medical model changes in that sense and like listens to people when their instincts are saying, like, something is wrong here.
Right. And how crazy making is it? Because we know our bodies, right? I've lived
Yes.
every day of my life in my body, right? I know how my body
Yes.
works more than some doctor who has known me for 10 minutes knows my body, right?
Hmm.
And that's not to minimize their experience, right? I'm not trained, so there are things I don't know, but to not be willing to meet your patient or your client and really hear them and have those conversations is just such a disservice that women have to deal with.
Yes. Okay. So you went and you talked to a doctor. Where did that take you?
Yes. So like I said, that diagnosis was pretty hard for me. Um, I think it's hard for a lot of women to,
Yeah.
have any kind of diagnosis like that. Um, for me, I just felt like kind of broken. It was
Hmm.
like now that I have a diagnosis, like this is real. right? Before it was like, well, maybe it'll happen, right? Maybe my body just needs to regulate after being on birth control for so long. But then facing that was like, okay, this is a real thing. And so I ended up going to a different doctor who I loved. They were so supportive and great and heard my concerns. And so we started on this journey of trying to manage the PCOS, right? So like, let's get my body to ovulate like it should, and function like it should in that way so that we have a chance. And what that meant at the time was taking hormonal medication.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So how old were you at the time that you're looking at taking like hormonal medication? And I know birth control is hormonal. We just like don't think about it in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think I was 27.
Okay.
Yep.
So pretty young still.
Pretty young still. Yeah. And it wasn't like a constant med age. So I would start my cycle, and then I would take meds from day 3 to day 7, while I was on my period. And then the idea was then like that would cause me to ovulate then later. And so then we like, timed everything out and would try, and then we'd wait to see if that would happen. And our story was, things were a little bit more challenging because my husband traveled for work at the time. And so, we'd have like 1 month where we could try and then a month or 2 where we couldn't because, obviously if he's not there, we can't make a baby. So,
what do doctors say about that when you can't try? Like, does that throw anything off? Does that throw data or anything like that off?
It's so interesting that you asked that question because I was thinking about that when I was thinking about this podcast. And we just like didn't medicate that cycle. So
Okay.
my husband wasn't there, I wouldn't take it. Now I don't know, like would that have made a difference? If I would have medicated just to kind of keep that regularity.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, but that was not the advice that I had at the time. We tried 2 different medications. One was letrozole, it's called, and I think I did 9 rounds of that over the course of maybe a year and a half.
So 9 rounds, that's like 9 cycles?
Yep, 9 cycles. Yep.
Okay, so in layman's terms, like basically 9 months of your life, you're trying this one med.
Yep, yeah, exactly. And it was like spread out because my husband was working. So like it was really probably over like 15 to 18 months. And that didn't work. And the thing was like, it seemed like it was working, right? So like we had no reason to believe that the medication wasn't causing me to ovulate, but I still wasn't getting pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
And, I would use, I don't know if you're familiar, but the ovulation test strips, right? So like,
yep. I was actually just thinking to ask you about that because I know like people will talk about them and like the different ones and was this one fully coated and whatever, and does this give an accurate yeah, I hear that all the time from people.
I felt like they were not accurate at all, but like that was the only way we knew, and they were so expensive. I mean,
oh, really?
A box of like 5 of them at the time was like $70. And yeah, which like, yeah, $70 is like, it's not like a huge amount of money, but when you're constantly having to buy them, right? Like,
yes.
And if my cycle was off, right, I might be testing for 15 days, right? And sometimes you have to test twice a day to try and catch that spike. And sometimes they wouldn't work. And I remember just like being like in my bathroom and so frustrated. And I can talk a lot about, kind of the emotional side of it too. But, and you would put this thing in the little pea strip in the test, that it's like a plastic thing. And there would be like this smiley face, which just was like,
oh my gosh, mocking.
Yes, exactly.
Oh,
and sometimes you would put it in and it would error. And it was like, oh, and it would always be like when it was the last one. And of course, I never had more, right? Because they're $70. So it'd be, 8:00 at night, and we'd be like, okay, now we have to go to the pharmacy and find more. And so it was annoying.
As you were talking about like testing in your bathroom, I just had this thought of like, we think about therapy offices, like witnessing a lot of emotions for people. Holy shit, I can only imagine the emotions that were experienced in your bathroom during all of this, and, like, how those walls have probably seen it even more than, like, therapy office walls and, like, held more than that.
Oh my gosh. My bathroom walls, if they could talk, would tell you some stories.
Mhm.
We have since moved, but when I think about when I was thinking about talking about it, I just have these like flashes of being in there just sobbing, right? And
Oh,
looking at myself
yeah.
in the mirror and being like, like this, it just didn't, I didn't even feel like myself. Like it
Yeah.
just took so much away.
Well, and it, like, occupies so much of your brain space knowing, like, I have to test twice a day and I have to watch for this and, just, like, I have to be able to go to the bathroom at this time and will it work
Mm.
this time? Won't it work this time? All of the things. Like, it's just it has
Yes,
to be all consuming.
it is completely all consuming. And it's such a roller coaster too, right? So you go through a cycle and you're trying and you find out 4 weeks from when you started
Mhm.
and you find out because you get your period, right? And so
Whoa.
you are crushed, right? I mean, so in our journey, that happened 42 times. There were 42 months where, we had these really high hopes and then these just really crushing lows. And and then your cycle day one, so you start again, right? Like
There's no
there's
break, there's no time to process,
yeah,
there's none of that.
exactly.
When you would test for or you'd get your period or test, I guess either of them, like, was your husband there with you, or are you going through this by yourself? Like, I
Like,
have 42 times you know, of learning that you're not pregnant in addition to, like, having to test to see if you're ovulating, like, that's a lot of time by yourself.
yeah, I mean, my husband is incredibly supportive and was completely with me on this journey. But I mean, just by the fact that you're testing so often and like you said, like things are so timed, like he's certainly not there every time, right? And he's always there to listen and always,
Mhm.
he was fully with me in the journey. But yeah, I mean, I think it's an isolating experience, right? Um, and like you said, like those bathroom walls saw so
Yeah.
much, and most of that was just me, right? Like,
Mhm.
um, so yeah, he was there, and he went through it too. I mean, it would be a whole nother conversation, I think, to hear his
Yeah,
experience.
we never really get the male perspective of child loss, infertility, like, it's not their bodies, and they're still watching these women that they love and care about so much go through some just incredibly horrific moments, and they can't do anything, and so when you think about, like, stereotypical men, that's, like, their worst case scenarios.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that he just wanted to be able to fix it.
Mhm. I'm curious what he said when you told him you were coming on the podcast, because I have to imagine you told him.
Oh yeah, he was like so pumped. He
Ah!
was like loving this for me. He's like, you should tell your story, our
Mhm.
story, really.
I maybe should have asked at the beginning. Have you told your story before?
I've told pieces of my story.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I've shared, some of the bigger part. I don't know that I've ever really talked about like the nitty gritty.
Well, I appreciate you being willing to do that with me and here, and I mean, we know each other in real life, but I also follow you on social media, and so I see this life that you've now created after you've gone through, like, these horrific experiences, and it just, like, warms my heart every time I see you post a picture with your kids or, you guys either go to a pumpkin patch or an apple orchard in the fall every year, and I,
Yeah,
like,
yep.
wait for those pictures every year. It just makes my heart so happy for you,
Yeah,
just because I know the struggle that it took to get there for you. Just I mean, a little bit of it. Obviously, I'm getting a lot of the story right now too. It
yeah,
just people only typically only see, like, that happy outcome, and I know that there's so much leading up to that. So, you did 9 months of the letrozole,
yes,
then where
yeah.
did we end up?
So from there, we decided to try another med, Clomid, if you're familiar.
Yep.
I am convinced that Clomid is the worst medication in the world.
Ah!
Um, People would probably argue that point, but um, it this medication, when I was on it, the only way I could describe it was that I was on fire with emotion all the time. Like, I just felt so raw and so like amped up all the time.
And you're working as a therapist when you're taking this, right?
Oh yeah. Yep. So, I mean, and these are the vulnerable parts that I haven't really shared before. But yeah, so I'm taking these meds, like I'm already going through this. I mean, really, I view it as a journey of grief, right? It's just like
Yep.
continual loss of like this idea. And you're trying to grapple with like, okay, I still have hope for getting pregnant and having a baby, but I'm also trying to find other things in life to be hopeful about because I have to face the fact that this might not happen for us. And so that's all happening. And I'm taking this med that just, you know, it really increased the depression, the anxiety. And so there were nights where I just sobbed on my bathroom floor. I mean, there were times where I thought about ending my life, right? It was just so painful. And like I said before, I felt so broken. And I remember having conversations with my husband and saying, like, you should leave me. Like, you should go find a wife who can have kids because I know you want it. And of course, he was like, I'm never going to do that, right? Like,
Right.
I love you and I'm with you in this, and this isn't just you, this is our journey. But I was in such a dark place.
What made you not act on those thoughts of wanting to end your life? Because I think that's a big thing for people too, is like when your body feels that out of control, it's like, what hope is there? And so what are the things that you use to keep you grounded in this life?
I think I always knew that I didn't want to die.
Mhm.
I was having such a hard time. You know, part of it was going through all of the changes with my body and all of the, you know, the treatments and like I said, that roller coaster before. But I think I always had some hope. And people always told me, you know, don't give up hope. Like there's a way to have a baby. And I remember constantly, you know, my husband and I would talk about this and I would think about it a lot. Like I do have hope, but I have to have hope that it's just that I can have a good life. Like
Mhm.
I obviously have some hope because I keep trying, right? But like, so I think I was just like holding on to those like little bits of, well, you know, if we don't have a baby, then maybe we can travel, right? Or maybe we
Yep.
can, you know, we talked about like we'll get a penthouse downtown, right? Which probably isn't
Yeah.
realistic anyway, but you know, it was like just trying to grab onto these things of like I can grieve this and get through it and still find some hope and some joy in my life.
Mhm.
And I also think like getting off of Clomid, so that was like 3 months of my life. Like then it kind of like the suicidal thoughts were not there anymore. It really was a combination of all of the things, and I think that
Yes.
particular medication was just it didn't work well with my body, and so I had talked to my doctors too and said like I need to be done. Like no matter what routes we go forward with in treatment, like Clomid cannot be part of this picture because I cannot go back there.
Was that difficult for you to advocate to your doctors? I know sometimes doctors have very set ideas about structures and timelines, and so I'm curious how that was for you.
Yeah, you know, we didn't have results with it anyway. I think maybe it would have been different if like I had been on Clomid and finally got a positive pregnancy test, right? That maybe resulted in a loss, then maybe they would have pushed for that. But it was like, well, neither of these really worked on their own. So like it's okay to go forward and try something else.
Mhm. Okay, so you knocked out 2 meds, still not a positive pregnancy test in any of that. Then where do you go?
So at that point, well, one point in there, it might have been a little bit earlier even, I had to do what's called an HSG, which is, if I try to say the actual name, I'm going to destroy it. So I'm just going to say HSG. They put a catheter through your uterus and inject fluid into your fallopian tubes to see if they're open. So that happened. That was fine.
What was that procedure like? Just so like if ever a woman is offered that test, like what could they expect?
So it was done in a lab. So they have two doctors. They have the doctor who actually does the procedure, and then they have like a tech who's doing, I think it's an X-ray or something of the sort. I'm not exactly sure what scan they use. So you're in that room. It's like 10 minutes. Some women experience like pretty significant pain with it. My experience was not bad. I took some like ibuprofen before, and it was 10 minutes. It wasn't comfortable, but it was fine. I did feel like it was a pretty vulnerable experience though, right? I mean, you're like splayed out. There's multiple doctors, which, can be invasive.
Yeah.
But it was fairly quick. For us, we got good news. Everything was functioning well, which also, if you're going through infertility, it's good news, but it can be really difficult to not have an answer.
Yeah, I was going to say it has to be bittersweet to know that like structurally everything is fine. It just doesn't give you any answers as to why nothing is working.
Right. And ultimately, so because my PCOS became under control and I was ovulating, they changed my diagnosis to unexplained infertility. So we really had no answers as to why at that point. After that, I was referred to a fertility clinic. And so we met with them in December of 2019. So we're 3 years in. And the nurse practitioner that we met with was wonderful and supportive. And it was the first time, I think, in the whole journey where I felt like I went into a doctor and I kind of felt at peace. I think that was for a number of reasons. I think there was some hope in, okay, now we're with doctors who do this all the time. And also they were really sensitive to what we were going through. And so they were really mindful of how they spoke, and that this was going to be a journey for us. And that, by the time you get to a fertility clinic, you're pretty, I don't even know the right word. There's hope there, right? But you're also
it feels like a Hail Mary almost.
Yeah, exactly.
I kind of want to circle back to, you made the distinction that the doctors at the fertility clinic were mindful about the things they said. And I'm curious the things that you heard from doctors or people in your life that were maybe not so sensitive.
Oh, yeah. The first one I heard was, just lose weight, right? It'll happen. One doctor was like, you're young, like there's time, right? A nurse told me to just share a bottle of wine with my husband and, relax and have a date night.
Stop it.
Yep. Which
like,
actually
I'll drink the whole bottle of tequila if that gets me pregnant. Like, holy shit.
That doesn't work, right? We've tried that. Not a whole bottle.
Multiple times.
But yeah, we've tried to relax. We've been through that, our journey of trying to get pregnant stopped being this like relaxing, fun experience a long time ago. It's been pretty procedural and timed. And anyway, and those messages came a lot from other people too. And I am fortunate that I have a really amazing support system. And our families are supportive. I have, great friends. And still, there were a lot of things that were said that were really hurtful and really invalidating of our experience. And even some of the well-meaning things that were said, just have hope, or just adopt, or do IVF, and just do this. And I know what the options are. I know that adoption is an option. I know that IVF could be a route for us, but also it's not just do these things. A big part of that is, I don't know if you looked into adoption, but it's tens of thousands of dollars.
Right,
And a
right.
long process. And same for IVF.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, we had no coverage for IVF. And in most states, I believe, last I checked, there is no requirement to do that. Though I think things may have changed now. And I know many
How about
states.
for the like Clomid and the Letrozole, all of those things? Did you have insurance coverage for any of those, or are those out of pocket expenses typically for people?
Our insurance did cover most of that. Now we had copays and deductibles and all of
Mm-hmm.
that stuff. It's interesting that you ask about insurance. When we went to our consult, which I can get more into, but the nurse practitioner was like, "Oh, it's just too bad that we don't live in New York because they are mandating IVF and IUI coverage for their employees." And we were like, "Yeah." And then my husband said, "Wait, what?" Because his job was based in New York at the time. And so, yeah, so our coverage was out of New York. And she said, well, starting in 2020, they have to provide coverage for these things. And so that was really good news for us because
Mm-hmm.
we didn't think that IVF was going to be possible. We didn't have that kind of money.
Well, most people don't have like tens of thousands of dollars
No,
just waiting around when they're like trying to have children. So,
right, exactly, yeah. So that was good news. A lot of states don't have coverage, and my hope is that changes. And I think there's more to talk about it. I hear more now than I did then, which is encouraging.
okay, so you're coming up on the end of 2019, going into 2020, which we know is pandemic year too.
Yeah.
So I'm not excited. I'm interested to hear this, how the next couple things transpired.
Yeah. So the nurse practitioner at that consult told us we had a 1% chance of getting pregnant on our own, which
Oh,
was crushing. And
mm-hmm.
yet we kind of knew. So the next step for us was IUI. And so for those that aren't familiar with IUI, it's intrauterine insemination. So for me, that meant another medicated cycle. And I did what's called a trigger shot. So I would go, I don't remember how many scans I had, maybe 3 or 4 in the first couple weeks of my cycle. And then they would monitor, how the follicles were growing. And when they got to a certain size, as long as all my hormones were good, so they would do blood tests as well, then I could take what's called a trigger shot, which would make me ovulate. So you do the trigger shot, and then I can't even remember how much time it was, maybe like 36 hours later, they would do the procedure. And what they do is they take a sperm sample and they call it washing it. So they kind of pick out all the good sperm and get rid of anything that might be in the way. And then they inject that with a catheter just right into the uterus. So my first round was in January of 2020, and it was not successful. And at that point, we didn't even really think that IUI was going to work. I think we were so defeated. And my husband and my mindset was that we were just doing this as a path to get to IVF. We're thinking we're going through this procedure. We're going to show on paper that this isn't working, and then we'll start IVF. We took February off of trying, actually, because we had a vacation planned. And when you are doing IUI or IVF, there are a lot of appointments. So you're tracking, your hormone levels with blood work. They're, doing ultrasounds regularly. And so it was just, if we wanted to go on this trip, we can't do it, which was fine. We need it.
Because you had been trying for almost 3 years at that point already.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, over 3 years at that point. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So 3 years would have been that December, and then so we're into January. So we go on our vacation, and as we all know, that month, everything shut down, including fertility clinics. So treatments were canceled. I mean, people's treatment cycles were canceled in the middle of their treatment cycle. So I can't imagine, being a woman or, a couple going through IVF and doing stims, and which is, lots of shots and medications to really grow the follicles, which is a really difficult experience. And then finding out, days before, nope, you're not gonna.
Yeah, to have that little bit of hope that you maybe have just ripped away from you. Oh,
What's interesting is I don't even remember what that month was like in terms of infertility. And I was talking to one of my good friends who's also experienced infertility and has some similar things that she's gone through. And I said, I don't remember, I can't remember what that was like. And she said, oh, you were struggling. You were having a really hard time. And I just think back and I think, wow, it's amazing what our brains do to protect us, because I can connect with a lot of my infertility story, and I feel those feelings still. But that time it's like I totally blocked it out. Obviously, treatment wasn't happening. There was a really big push in the medical community to reopen fertility clinics. People were fighting and saying, this isn't an elective thing. This isn't plastic surgery. This isn't cosmetic. This is a very real issue that people have. And so by the time I started my next cycle, I was like, well, I'm just going to reach out and see what they say. Because there was talks about maybe they'd reopen. And I got
so like what month is this in that we're talking, like March, April?
March. Yep.
Okay.
Like no, not March. Must have been the end of March, early April.
Okay.
And I emailed the medical assistant. So when you start your cycle, the typical thing is email, and then they can get your booking scheduled and get your meds ordered and all of those things. I emailed her thinking she's just going to be like, sorry. But she said, actually, we're opening tomorrow. And so we can get you scheduled. We were so excited. Again, still like, this is just another step towards IVF, right? So we go through the cycle, did my medicated rounds and did my trigger shot. And in the midst of all that, we decided to sell our house. And so we put our house up on the market, and
because why not? Global pandemic, infertility, just put your house on the market too.
Right. Yep. And so I spent that we call it the 2-week wait, right? So you think you ovulate, or like ovulation happens, and then you have that 2 weeks where you're hoping and praying that you got pregnant. And I just threw myself into prepping our house. We had showings, and so we're all over the place. And that the day that we got our results, so the way that it works, I maybe should have said this before, is that you go in for a blood test 2 weeks after the IUI procedure. And so I go in for my blood test. It's always really early in the morning, and they call in the afternoon with your results.
Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. I know that the topics that we talk about on this podcast can be heavy and bring up a lot of emotions for people, and that's no reason to shy away from these conversations. If you're a fan of trying to get these conversations out to as many people as possible, I could use your help. Rating, reviewing, and subscribing to the podcast helps it reach more people. I always love to hear your feedback on the episodes that we put out and the topics that you want to hear more about. So head to www.redbirdcounseling.mn.com. From there, you can send me an email and join our online email community to get more updates about the podcast and everything happening mental health and Redbird Counseling. Be sure to also follow us on Instagram, Threads, and TikTok at Redbird Counseling MN, and Facebook, Redbird Counseling MN 21. Until next time, remember you're not alone, your story matters, be kind to yourself, and don't be afraid to color outside the lines.